In this session of review of GitLab Basics, I'm reviewing the command line basic commands document. From the title and looking at this initially, I imagine it's introducing me to command line utilities, perhaps functions or features of GitLab itself, since it's part of the GitLab Basics series. And it starts with the first heading is start working on your project. In Git, when you copy a project, you say clone it. To work on a Git project locally from your own computer, you will need to clone it. To do this, sign into GitLab. Probably one of the first things I note there is that seems to leap straight into start working on your project. Whereas it doesn't, at least at the start, give me any context as to what it is that I'm going to be covering in this particular document. It's titled Command Line Basic Commands. Therefore, I do some sort of introduction to the content that's going to be covered. In the first paragraph, it mentions clone twice, but it doesn't truly explain what a clone is. Again, that would not necessarily have to be contained within this document itself, but I'd expect it to be perhaps a link to another document that does explain what a clone is. Or it could well be, sufficient to, mention that the reader of this document has to have some knowledge of the basics of Git, in which case I'd already know what a Git clone is. So it says at the end of the first paragraph, to do this, sign into GitLab. That instruction suggests that is the action needed to clone the repository, whereas that's a little bit awkward because the following paragraph continues on the instructions, but there's not a direct connection between the end of the first paragraph and the start of the second paragraph. In following the instructions in the second paragraph, it says when you're on your dashboard, click on the project that you'd like to clone. Carries on there. The problem is that the screenshot that's shown doesn't look like the dashboard that you currently see within GitLab. So if I switch over to another tab here, where I'm already signed into GitLab, and I go back to the dashboard, click on my personal projects, that doesn't look as it does in the document itself. Now maybe I'm looking in the wrong spot, but it's not at all clear. It goes on to say, to work in the project, you can copy a link to the Git repository through SSH or HTTPS protocol. Some grammatical issues there, but they're minor. It gives you a choice, then explains that SSH is easier to use after it's been set up. There's a link there to SSH key setup, but again, it doesn't explain any the pros and cons of either of those options, when you might use one over the other. Particularly, it's mentioning that SSH is easier. Therefore, if we're talking about the basics, I think I'd be inclined to explain the easiest method. Perhaps with a reference to the other method or a link to how the other method works. But I want to be as prescriptive as possible, really. So it goes on, while you're at the project tab, select HTTPS or SSH from the drop-down menu and carries on. Again, that part of the UI within GitLab has changed. So we would need to change those instructions at least to match the changed UI. Aside from that, okay. Now the next section is titled On the Command Line. It says, this section has examples of some basic shell commands that you might find useful. For more information, search the web for bash commands. Now, some issues there. One is that someone is going to be operating or using Git at the command line, it could be reasonably assumed that they're already familiar with the command line. I don't think it benefits the particular target audience to list some quite basic, in this case, bash commands. If people don't already know these commands, then I'd suggest they should be using the web user interface, the GitLab web UI, that is. The other thing is if people are already using or are using shell other than bash, then of course none of this information is actually going to be relevant because we're presenting bash commands. Whereas if they're using perhaps the fish shell or ZSH, those commands won't be relevant. Oddly enough, though, what I find here is that the introductory content talked about cloning the repository. And provided some introductory information. Then we've put the actual command for cloning the project in a section that doesn't directly follow on from the previous. So that's essentially a step in a procedure, but it's not visibly tied to the instructions that were presented in the earlier on in the document, particularly here in the second paragraph. So it's rather confusing. I guess when it comes back to the start of the document, it's not clear again as to what it is that this document covers. It's not clear what's achieved by anyone who follows the instructions and or reads the information that's contained within this particular page. I guess essentially the outcome is not clearly stated. So we come back to the example commands, which again I would suggest are not at all useful. And then we finish with sample Git task flow. It says if you are completely new to Git, looking through some sample task flows will help you understand best practices for using these commands as you work. Now, I'd again suggest that the topic of this document and the associated documents are an introduction to GitLab basics. Therefore, the content should be focused solely on GitLab, with mention of Git as needed in context. But if someone's completely new to Git, they shouldn't be looking at this document, and presenting this link is, I think, a little confusing. Or rather, I think it's out of place. So all in all, I think we ought to, again, provide some introductory content to this document. I'd suggest, in fact, what we ought to do is to present the command line commands in context as part of the overall workflows. But I don't think there's a need to present a command line basic commands at all, simply from the point of view that if someone's working with Git at the command line, it can be reasonably assumed, or it can be stated as a prerequisite that they're familiar with the basic command line commands, such as navigating directories, listing the contents of directories, creating files, and searching for files, that sort of thing. So I think it would be better if we put this content elsewhere, and particularly move it so that it was in context of a workflow from end to end. And that's the end of my review of this document.